This is the golden question. Hello, hello, welcome to episode 21 of the Golden Question podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be answering the question, what is the irony with government help? And what I'm alluding to with government help is the slew of government programs that the government initiates in the guise of helping us and protecting us and enriching us. With the coronavirus epidemic, the government tries to step in and claim some help. And how does it do this? It supposedly instills new regulations, new rules, new laws that supposedly help consumers. It extends credit to businesses, and then it provides all these uh, side programs to help homeless people. And again, this is um, most notable in a lot of the big cities, especially New York City, where we're seeing a huge rise in homelessness. Unfortunately, all these solutions that supposedly the government tries to solve, they attempt to correct the problem after the fact. And what I mean by that is they're not necessarily solving the problem. They're sort of just remedying the problem that already exists, and one that they take as a given, as something that they cannot change. And this is very weird because usually when you have a problem and you try to solve it, you're addressing the problem and you are essentially ridding yourself from that problem. You're trying to counter that problem with the solution. I mean, that's anybody's mindset of what a solution is. A solution gets rid of the problem and brings you back to that neutral state that you were before the problem had existed. Um, and again, this is the main premise here: is that you have a problem. I'm gonna reiterate it. You have a problem, and the solution now gets rid of that problem and brings you back to your neutral state. But what the government does is it doesn't address the problem at all. It just tries to put makeup on the problem, make it look pretty with all these alternative programs, all these alternative side effects that supposedly help remedy the problem. But again, none of these things actually address the problem, such as the problem with homelessness. And I'm going to jump to this problem real quick, right? You have homelessness. What does homelessness tell you? People can't afford to live. They probably don't have jobs. They can't afford the food. They can't afford a bunch of just your everyday life necessities. And why can't they afford them? Right, prices are too high. There's not enough business competition, um, and there's a slew of other variables that results in higher prices, inflation, high taxes, high regulations, high just general business burden that results in high prices. So if I were to fix this problem, if I saw that there was a large quantity of homelessness, I would address that problem by removing what got me to that scenario, what got me to the case of having homelessness, and I would revert back those policies that I've passed, effectively bringing me back to the state before I implemented all these policies. But of course, the government can never admit its problems. That's the last thing the government will do, and that's probably something that the government would sacrifice everything else just so that they won't admit their problems. Because the government obviously wants to be the beacon of truth, the beacon of knowledge, the beacon of hope that people look towards uh, when times are dire. So homelessness, if one you were to just ask a person, how do we fix homelessness? Not how do we remedy it, not how we try to make it better or try to make it less hurtful or have a less of an impact on the individuals who are already homeless. How do we actually remove homelessness? How do we actually get those people back working, And that's what any person with any right mind would do when addressing a problem. But again, the government doesn't think like that. So what does the government do? It tries to say, all right, these homeless people, let's provide housing for them, let's provide food for them. But you don't really address the problem. You haven't solved the problem. You're just remedying the problem, and you're sort of accepting the problem as a given. And so the perfect example here is with the coronavirus. When you have a pandemic or any natural disaster that puts a an unnatural, I know it's ironic because it is a natural event, but it puts in a burden on a business that's not normal, right? Not under normal conditions. So it puts this abnormal condition. There we go. This it puts this abnormal burden that affects the condition of the business. What should any right mind do? If you're looking at this and you see that your business is starting to suffer, you would of course see or try to think of ways to remove some burden from it so that that um, obvious natural burden that's now being uh, implemented on it or that's being impacted on it can become less of a drag. And again, I'm sort of missing my I'm trying to get my point out there by using the wrong words. But essentially, what I'm saying is you have a pandemic, which obviously is out of anybody's control, and you could look at it. You could substitute this pandemic for an earthquake or a tornado, which is something that's out of our control. We can't control and we can't predict, so to speak, a lot of these natural events that can happen to a business. So when they do happen, your first sense is obviously you can't reduce it. You can't reduce the impact of these events. They're there. You can accept those events as a given. What can you change, however, are all the other burdens that you've now, as a government, placed on those businesses. All these regulations, all these rules that would be applicable in a normal situation during normal times when times are good, but now that are so irrelevant that to keep the business alive, these burdens that the government has placed on the business sort of again are irrelevant. They don't matter, and they're not of concern anymore, right? The main concern of the business now is just to survive. And an example, I mean, that I could give is, let's say me as a person, and again, I always like to equate or and try to compare and correlate businesses with people, because yes, they have different words for different things, but fundamentally they both operate the same way. So from an individual, let's say I like to exercise and I tell myself I need to exercise. And then, you could add something else, right? I want to have 8 hours of sleep, right? I place all these regulations on me that that I would want to follow during normal times. I want to have a nice diet. I want to cut down on, my dairy, whatever. So you place regulations, whatever they are, you place them on you. Now, what if you're on a plane and let's say, you make an emergency landing and you're in the middle of nowhere? Do those regulations, do those rules apply to you anymore? Are they of importance to you anymore? Right? If you're out in the wild and the likelihood of you dying is exponentially increased as compared to you during normal times. Does it matter if you're on a diet? Does it matter if you're keeping track of your water? Well, in this case, keeping track of your dairy intake. Does it matter if you're exercising? No, because those regulations, first of all, were already a burden with you during normal times, but especially now, those don't matter anymore. Your case now is just to try to survive. Do whatever the hell you can to survive. I'll put those burdens, I'll put those rules and regulations on pause for the moment while I just try to survive. And I see this exactly mirrored in businesses where now businesses have this pandemic, they have this event that is out of their control that cripples them, right? Economically, but they still again, I don't understand how anybody could argue this, but they still or logically process this. They still have to abide by the same rules and regulations that were before. I mean, right? They have to have somebody come in. I have to have a license. I have to have somebody inspect this, right? Why does that matter during this pandemic? If my business is in jeopardy of complete bankruptcy. So this is the irony where the way to truly help businesses during a time of pandemic, and again, it doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could be an earthquake or tornado, any natural event from God. Truly, the best way to help them is to relieve them from some of the burdens that you've imposed on them that could obviously be revoked, right? Nature's burden cannot be revoked. It's out of your control. Once it hits you, there's no reversing back or trying to get rid of it. It's there. That's the given. That's uncontrollable. What you could do is you could remove some of the layered burdens that the government has layered on top so that they have more, room to more freedom to move around and more capital freed up so that they could deal with the burden, the natural burden that obviously they can't, that is out of their control and that nobody else can control. So this is the irony where you have a time of pandemic, and what does the government do? Instead of cutting down on itself, cutting down on burden, lowering taxes, let's say for example, right? If you can barely survive yourself with your income, what use does it do if you pay taxes or not? During a time of a pandemic, I should be able to keep as much of my income as possible. And paying taxes is something that we should do as sort of this luxury thing. Oh yes, we pay taxes. I have so much wealth that I can afford giving a portion of my income without it uh, hindering my life to a certain extent. So it's ironic how government during times of pandemics, during times of natural disasters, from a logical point of view, from my point of view, government should decrease in size, but of course they don't. And that's one of the ironies with government help is that they actually use times of crises to expand and to increase the burden on others. And again, there's a great analogy, and I forgot who um, uh, derived it, but what this person said was, and this is sort of off topic about what I was saying before about the natural crises, but I'll expand more on it. What this person said was the government cripples you and then comes rushing in with the crutches saying, "Here, I'm here to offer you some help. You see, without these crutches, without me, you wouldn't have had these crutches, and you would have died essentially." So we go from there being a natural disaster, and the true way for the government to help businesses is to relieve some of the burden it has imposed on these businesses because it's a luxury thing. The fact that these businesses give up some of their freedom, some of their capital towards the government is a luxury thing. If a business is in dire conditions and it's in jeopardy of their livelihood, then the first thing that should go is all these government burdens that are irrelevant now, that my sole purpose, my sole goal is to stay alive. Again, as a business, you can apply to a personal level. So again, back to the idea of the government crippling you and then offering the crutches. We could go back and apply that to the homelessness example, or the homelessness example, where you have to solve a problem by first recognizing that there is a problem and trying to get rid of it, not remedy it or anything. But what people fail to understand, and what the government doesn't want to admit, is that they are the cause of that problem. the government has made the economy in a weakened state that has enabled, you know, the rise in homelessness. But of course, the government isn't going to admit to that, and they like to just state that that problem is given, that's out of their control, and so they're going to try to remedy it. Um, so, as is the case with homelessness, the government puts all these burdens on these businesses, makes the economy the way it is, but makes the current situation, makes people. I mean, a big culprit, I guess, would be the minimum wage, not letting people be employed at a certain level below. I mean, if you're homelessness and you don't have a job, I don't care what. Again, you can apply this to the dire conditions that one could be in, and him removing some of those regulations that he's imposed on himself. Same, you could apply to the minimum wage. Sh- Should we get rid of the minimum wage in this time, during this pandemic, so we can let people who otherwise wouldn't be employed, um, even though they might have a decrease in wages? It's a sacrifice that they should be willing to make. They need to be able to get anything rather than nothing. It's almost like, and I'm gonna apply to the example again. Let's say, again, I'm stranded out, um, in the middle of nowhere, and I told myself I'm gonna have a diet where I don't eat meat. Let's say, so a, a, a regulation that I've imposed on myself. But now that I'm in this dire strait, I'm about to die. I lift that restriction off me. It's not like I'm stranded in the middle of nowhere. The likelihood of me dying is increased dramatically, and I see what's an animal that I could eat? I don't know. I see let's say it's a beaver, right? Let's say there's a beaver right in front of me. Am I going to say no, I don't want to eat that? I need to stick to my regulations that I've imposed while times are good and starve myself to death? Does that make any sense? I don't think it does to any right mind. I think, especially during a pandemic, again, apply this to any scenario. When you have a condition where the economy is going to go down inevitably un uh, because of this natural uncontrollable event, get rid of these regulations that you've imposed. Get rid of these burdens that you've imposed on people. One being the minimum wage. Let people be able to work for wages that are below the minimum wage, because not everybody is going to be able to provide a productivity that is at that level. And not every business is going to be able to provide that wage to people, given that the business themselves is now having a reduction of their customers. So the business is obviously going to respond. If the business is forced to pay their customers that minimum wage, and the business now has a decrease in customers, well, the least worst thing that could happen is for the business to just fire some of its employees, which then leads those employees to go from having $15 minimum wage to no wage, as opposed to them just having a reduction in a wage. But the worst thing that could happen is for the business to just obviously somehow risk its entire business life and just completely go declare bankruptcy, right? To close its doors, and then that, obviously everybody gets fired. But on top of that, now the customers, now the economy, society loses out on the goods and services that that business was producing. So that's the worst case scenario. Again, minimum wage is just one of a slew, a line of different rules and regulations that make no sense during a time of, of a pandemic, during a time of crises, right? When there's a war broken out, is it going to matter whether or not, right, I pay the worker the minimum wage if half my store is blown open and there's shots being fired across the street? Of course it doesn't. So you have a lot of these rules and regulations. It's in a way, right? When I look at a lot of these rules and regulations, these laws that are imposed, it's sort of a luxury um, it's sort of a luxury privilege that we're able to burden ourselves with the minimum wage with all these different rules and regulations. And that's why a lot of the times you don't see these rules and regulations in impoverished countries because that's the least of their concerns. Their least of their concerns isn't whether or not a worker makes $15 as opposed to $14 an hour. It's sort of this first class, first world uh, problem where I'm not making $15 an hour. I'm making 14. Therefore, that is a problem, and I must, demand my $15 minimum wage. There must be a law place that forces that wage on me. But again, when you have a time of crisis, that's uncontrollable, that's unpredictable. That should be the least of your concerns. So there's a list of government programs that are ironic because they're all burdens. All these rules and regulations, these things that are meant to help us in a way, they're all a burden on us. And we've placed that burden on ourselves because of how wealthy we are. It's ironic that, or it's not ironic, but it's interesting to see that you have a capitalist, and the cycle is you always have a capitalist nation that starts off, that creates wealth, and then you have all these rules and regulations that come after. You never see those rules and regulations first in a nation, which then creates wealth. It's always a nation starts off poor, it grows really, really wealthy thanks to capitalism, thanks to the free market. And then slowly but surely over time, you have rules and regulations, you have taxes that start eating away at that wealth, which then lowers obviously the standard of living for that nation, lowers the economy for that nation. And you see this all over the place. You see every time socialism gets implemented, where they take these rules and regulations to a national scale and they blow them up tenfold or a hundredfold, you see the standard of living go down. But they had to eat away from something. What do they eat away from? The wealth that was created prior. I got off on a little tangent there, but the irony in these government programs is that the the real government help is a decrease in government. That's the real help. That's the irony, is that when you have a time of crisis, government should be saying, "All right, I'm here to help. Let me lower my burden that I have on you." Not the other way around. Let me not offer you these services that increases your burden. And it's ironic because now you have a lot. I'm using ironic a lot in this word, but you're seeing now the government's going to start instituting some laws. Businesses must have these many customers in the store at a time, or the business owners or all the employees must be wearing masks. They must make sure their temperature's right. Right. You pile on new rules and regulations. Meanwhile, the business is just trying to survive. And this is the big irony that I see, is that government help during a time of crisis is in fact truly should be a reduction in government. Government should be approaching you by saying, I'm going to take away some of these rules and regulations. I'm going to free up some of your capital for you to survive. But who knows? I mean, this could be part of the plan. This could be part of the plan for government to expand, is that they take advantage of these crises of moments to expand. They can start providing all these helps that in reality actually hurt you. And then they end up impoverishing everybody, and then they end up being the main the beacon of government of or the sorry the government ends up being the main beacon of knowledge, of employment, of education. The government is it's technically the last one standing. So the government destroys all businesses, and then after everything goes down to rubble, the government is the last thing that's standing and says, "You see, this all doesn't work out. You guys need to rely on me for this, for X, Y, and Z." So that's the great irony that I see in government. And I guess I didn't want to get into this, but I'll throw it in there. A lot of these government programs, apart from government help by with all these rules and regulations, and I also want to get into something else, but part of these government programs, their incentive is actually not to solve the problem. And again, we've heard this saying before. I just want to make sure for those who haven't heard about it, but a lot of these government programs, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the last thing they want to do is solve the problem, right? Because solving the problem, essentially they end up having to shut their doors at the end because, all right, we have the problem solved. So what they do is they instead help perpetuate the problem even further to then justify the own existence of that program or that agency. So you have different agencies in the government that are supposed to help different sectors of the economy, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. But in effect, they're just making those sectors of the economy worse, which then justifies their own existence. They could say, "Hey, we need more funds, or um, we need more employees, or we need more funds to help solve this problem," because they can never admit to failure, ever. First of all, even if they try to solve the problem, they can't. But let's say they did, that's that's not something they would want to do, right? If someone's paying me to solve a problem, um, if that payment is actually someone um, giving me a fixed amount of money, telling me, here, you have this amount to solve this problem, and then that's it, well, I'm going to be incentivized to solve that problem. But if that person who's giving me the money is just, voter base, or it's just the Federal Reserve that's printing up the money, and who knows, maybe I'm incentivized by another agency to, or another part of the government to solve that problem, my least um my I'm most incentivized to not solve the problem, so I can continue receiving funds from whoever is giving me it. So I can tell them, hey, I need more funds. And if you object to it, oh, you don't want the problem to be solved then if you don't want to give me the money. And that's really the argument that they do, right? When you tell them, oh, you don't want a Department of Energy, really? You don't want the Department of is it Department of Environment? I'm sorry, Environmental Protection. The the EPA, yes, the Environmental Protection Agency. It's not a department, or is it? I'm not sure. But the EPA, right? Somebody who's against the EPA will say, "Hey, you don't want to help make the environment better?" It's no. The EPA is actually doing more harm than helping. Why? Because then it justifies the own existence of the EPA. Do you think the EPA actually wants to help the environment? Well, if it did supposedly help the environment, then we don't need the EPA anymore once the problem gets solved. But of course, that's not what they want. The government is incentivized, any government program is incentivized to stay in existence for as long as possible. Not only that, but to expand, to funnel in more cash and then this is why a lot of these agencies get bloated. This is where the bureaucracy comes in, right? These agencies just end up hiring a bunch of people, and it creates the most uh, inefficient process. It just becomes a huge mess, which then ends up not, uh, it enables them not to solve the problem, which they, regardless of whether or not the agency gets bloated or inefficient, I don't think the government could ever fix a problem because these problems have way too many variables for any set of individuals to say, you know what, we understand all the variables, we could solve the problem, right? They can't act as a divine calculator to calculate all the different variables in a certain problem. I mean, it's really, this is the irony in government, is that they try to solve problems in the economy, but they don't understand how complex things are, how many different variables there are in the economy. But back to the incentive, this is why these agencies expand. This is why the bureaucracy expands, which makes them inefficient. And then they just demand more funds, right? We need more money. We need more. I need to hire. I need to use these funds to hire more employees. I need to increase my salary. And this is where everything comes from. And you could apply this to education as well, right? You have the teachers union as well as actual departments of educations where they, they're at least, the last thing they want to do is actually improve test scores. The last thing they want to do is actually improve, I guess you could say, the IQ of students, or to essentially to increase test scores. That's the last thing they want to do, because then it essentially says, all right, we have everything situated. We have something. Let's settle down. That's not what they want to do. They want to continue to expand, and so they're incentivized to actually keep test scores as low as possible, so they can demand, hey, teachers need more pay. we need to expand this. We need to build new buildings here. We need to hire more people. We need to open up more new schools. So it's just anything to just expand the bureaucracy, expand the program. And this is the irony of the government, is that you have it's incentivized not to solve a problem, as opposed to the free market, which is incentivized to solve a problem because there's a profit motive, and there's competition, as opposed to the government. No profit. There's no way for them to gauge whether or not they're making a difference because there is no profit. You can't record their expenses and track their revenue and then make them have a measure their break even point and then say that, hey, this profit means that we we want that agency to continue solving the problem. There is none of that with the government. So the government lacks the ability to produce a profit, which again removes our gauge to see how effective it is. And there is no competition. So the government can't compete with another company to solve a problem. So this is two factors that the government lacks, which makes it inefficient in operating as a business or any entity. So I think we've sort of discussed a little bit about some ironies in government, how a government program is incentivized to perpetuate the problem, and how a government program doesn't actually solve the problem. It just tries to remedy it, it just tries to mask it. And why doesn't it want to solve the problem? Because it isn't admitting to the problem. And why isn't it admitting to the problem? Because it created the problem. Its policies prior to the problem coming into existence is a result of their own policies. And because their policies were in place, that's what caused the problems. You can apply this to education. Again, you can apply this to every single program. I'll just add another one here, just in case you haven't realized the pattern here. You have the education system. You had back then, we've lowered the voting age down to 18 from 21, just around the Vietnam War, just prior to it. And so the government goes, all right, what could we do to help gain the votes of these students? So they say, you know what, let's help them out with their college. Let's provide them loans so that they don't have to uh, pay for their college. They could just attend college for free and they could pay back the loan once they graduate. And they could instead use those funds while they're working, when they would normally work and have to save up for the funds for college, they could use those funds for themselves or something like that. So, well, not something like that. That's exactly how it happens. It's literally a politician trying to gain the votes of this new voter base, right? You have 18, so now these kids aren't in college yet. So now the government has to think of something that that it could attract this new voter base with. So you have these students who unfortunately don't know any better, and this is why the 18-year-olds of the 1970s aren't the 18-year-olds of the 1800s. So this idea that these kids could vote, they understand politics, and they understand the world around them, and it gives them the ability to vote, is highly flawed. Now there are people who would argue that yes, because these 18-year-olds are fighting in the army, they should have a say. There is an argument for that, or one could simply just say 18-year-olds shouldn't have been in the army to begin with. But we could go down that route. So you have the government now providing guaranteed loans to these students. Well, if you're a college and these students are not paying you from their own money, they're just getting the money from the government to pay you, why not increase the prices? First of all, there's limited resources. It's not like you can now afford to take in all these new students and educate them, because then that's going to drastically increase your expenses. So it's going to increase your expenses, and again, there's limited staff that you have. There's limited schools, so you're forced to build more, to hire more teachers, to hire more professors, to hire more staff to help
educate this new influx of students that normally wouldn't have come in this large amount without these loans. So the government gives all these kids these loans. The colleges now see this huge influx of people wanting to go to college. Now it has to raise prices so that it can uh, adjust to the increase in demand because their expenditures gone up, and obviously supply isn't going to catch up that easy. But it goes farther than that. It's more psychological because now the colleges realize, wait a second, these kids are getting the money from the government. The government is just printing the money out of thin air. So, and even if these kids default, the government is just going to give them the money. So, and I'm going to get the money right away when a kid when I provide these loans to these kids, that loan is essentially owned by the government now. It's out of my control. I'm getting paid for it. If the kid defaults, I still get paid for that money. So why should I try to lower my prices to try to attract the students? No matter what price I give, these kids are just going to get that money from the government, and that loan is essentially backed by the government. If the kid defaults, even if I offer an $1 million tuition tag, the government's still going to have to guarantee that loan. So that's what happens. So the government creates this problem, and now they get to a certain extent where the prices are so exuberant that the kids now demand, hey, these colleges are so expensive, we can't afford to pay back the payments, even when they graduate. Now the college degree has no longer become worth that that price. So when they graduate before, or when the program first started, they were able to pay back these government loans with their degrees. But now the price have gotten so high that the degree no longer provides the correct amount of funds for them to pay back the tuition. What does the government now do? The government says, aha, you see, we need to provide free public college. We need to nationalize the college industry, and provide free college to everyone because you see the prices are out of control. So you see how it masks the problem. It doesn't actually solve the problem from its root cause. The problem is college prices are high. What's the government solution? Let's nationalize colleges. But that isn't a solution. You're not addressing that problem. You're just providing an alternative. You're just masking the problem in a sense. To solve the problem, you need to understand, why did these prices increase? And the answer is, which the government doesn't want to admit, is because the government initially started to provide loans, guaranteeing loans to these students that otherwise banks wouldn't have provided loans to an 18-year-old who doesn't have a job, who doesn't have any life experience or any work experience, right? Who doesn't have a credit score. And first of all, the idea of taking a loan to go to school or taking a loan to do anything, especially at a young age, is a very bad thing. So the government just incentivizes this bad thing. So the government never wants to address this problem. So that this government solution, this government help, this government program that people now are thinking about is actually part of the problem. The government loan, the Department of Education providing these loans is technically, you could describe it as a program. It's a loan program. It's a loan service. The loan service is responsible for the increase in price, which is the problem that it's trying to trying to subdue. That's the irony. So you could look at it again. We've talked about the education system, the irony of the government loan service, the government helping students by giving them these loans. The very reason why they're giving them these loans is so that they can afford these high prices. Why are those high prices there? Because the government is providing them that loans. It's this self perpetuating cycle that originally emanates from the government, but then it feeds on itself. And I think that's the best way to describe it. That's the best way to describe any government program, is that it it initiates itself and then it feeds on off itself, and then it just grows that way. So you could look at it through education, um, and you could look at it through the war on poverty, um, the Department of Housing, the Environmental Protection Agency. All these programs are created to solve a problem that they created or the government created. And this is the irony with government programs. This is the irony with government help. and they're not incentivized to help you. They're incentivized to keep the problem going. And the irony is, government help is actually more burden when the government now is telling these businesses to abide by these new slew of regulations and rules. That's actually hurting. The best way for a government to help you, an honest government, is to revert back on some of the burdens that is in placed on you, or that it has forced you to oblige by. That's the best way to help someone. If and you could apply this back to your personal life. If you are in a diet, you have these regulations that you want to follow. If you're put in a scenario where it's life or death, do those regulations matter to you anymore? No, you put those to the side. You take those privilege. You take these diets, these rules and regulations that you provided for yourself as a privilege, right? Do people in impoverished countries, do people in Haiti and some poor countries in Southern America and in Africa and in um, Southeast Asia, are people there going on these diets? Are people there exercising? Or people there saying that they should be reading this much in a certain day, right? All these rules and regulations, and I've given horrible examples there, but all these rules and regulations are sort of privileges that we have, that we've in place on ourselves. It's weird because we're wealthy, and because we're privileged, we can place and afford to place those burdens on ourselves that we otherwise wouldn't if, again, we were in a life or death scenario. So that's it. That wraps it up. I hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned for a bunch of other topics that we'll be discussing in the future, and we'll be hosting a show that I'm going to separate from the podcast with my good friend Ethan, and we'll also be discussing a lot of stuffs there, and it's going to be interesting seeing conversation uh, be, between the two of us, and again, someone who doesn't necessarily 100% agree with me, and it's going to be interesting seeing back and forth there. So stay tuned. There's lots to come. As always, stay safe.